Hello and welcome to Japan Expert Insights and our Wednesday morning room with Tim Sullivan and me, Maya Matsuoka, as your hosts and moderators. In this podcast, we welcome comments, questions, and opinions. So if you haven't done so yet, join us next time on Clubhouse. In the meantime, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload all the conversations on Japanese politics, business insights, and Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific region. Yes, and it's 8 o'clock, so
Right.
we're going to start now. There are a few people in the room. More will join as we go on, because it's 8 o'clock in the morning in Japan.
Sure.
Yes, so just a quick introduction of Rajesh before we start. So Rajesh, you are... Just a moment. Okay, so the business owner of Global Strategic Advisory, Philadelphia-based a firm working in international business. And one of the things that I really liked about your profile, Rajesh, was the post you have pinned to the top of the profile, saying that the beauty of the world lies in the diversity of its people. And it is such a beautiful thing. And I can imagine also, how difficult it is to work in international business at the same time because of this diversity.
Certainly.
Yes, and especially when it comes to negotiations and also, let's say mergers and, any type of,
Right.
let's say actions that are typical to international business. So today we're going to let you talk and tell us, what you want to tell us about, your experience in the international business and so on. So without any further ado, please go on. And of course, after you finish, we're going to open the room for discussion and questions, observations as well. We have Yuka joined us now.
Okay.
Good morning.
All right. Maya, thank you for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts and views on this both interesting as well as a complex topic of negotiations. So let me begin by saying that, we really have no choice. We can negotiate effectively or we can negotiate ineffectively, but we do have to negotiate. And so, I think it is a critical skill. I think managers spend about 80% of their time in terms of negotiating. And negotiations are not just simply with an external customer or a supplier. I mean, these negotiations also occur within the organization. And so this is an area I've studied for a long time. And I started looking, and there are many, many different facets of international negotiations, and I will not get into a lot of them. So I will focus mainly on the cultural aspects of negotiations. And I got actually interested in the mid 80s and the early 90s when I interviewed, as part of my doctoral dissertation, a lot of Japanese and American managers who were doing business. And I focused on seeking to understand how culture shapes the negotiating process. And that was, it gave me a lot of insights. And what it fundamentally did was to show me that there's a very, very fundamental difference in the way that people across cultures negotiate. So there are many cultures in North America and Europe that are very task-based. You just, you negotiate you start the negotiations as soon as you meet, and you don't really spend a lot of time in building relationships or other things. Whereas, a lot of Japanese, a lot of Asians in general would like to get to know the other person before they actually get down to doing business. This discrepancy between a task-oriented approach to negotiations and a relationship-oriented approach to negotiations can be problematical, and unless managers are adequately prepared and really understand what this means, it can cause difficulties on either side. And, one of and Maya and others, for many of you who have engaged in cross-cultural interactions, I think one of the problems, one of the essential challenges here is that when we meet, somebody from another cultural background and we are not prepared for it, we are judging them from our own standpoint. And that is a huge mistake, a huge error. And yet, that is very instinctive and very natural to human beings because, we are controlled by our mind, and our mind actually wants predictability. So, what we do is we have an unfamiliar situation, we try to impose certain parameters on it without really getting a full grasp of what's going on. So there's a very well-known quote by, I think, a Finnish French writer. We do not see the world as it is, we see the world as we are. And this is just showing you the implicit bias that we actually bring to the table in negotiations. So when you have a negotiation, say, between a task oriented culture and a relationship oriented culture, you run into a problem if you're not prepared for it, which is that a task oriented person will wonder, is the other party really interested in negotiations? Because, they're talking about everything other than the subject at hand. Whereas the relationship oriented manager might wonder, what is going on here? I mean, why are these people in so much of a hurry? Why are they in so much of a rush? So I think that is, and that can actually cause lots of issues. So, for example, people coming from task oriented cultures are likely to get frustrated. They might get confused. They might get anxious because they're really not knowing what's happening. Whereas in relationship oriented cultures, when you see aggressive behavior on part of the other party, you begin to sense a certain distrust, and you're also confused, and you might actually seek to withdraw. So I think this is one of the most fundamental barriers I think I see in cross cultural negotiations. And there are lots of cases where I think the inability to develop a relationship has actually impeded the negotiations. And of course, I think in Asian cultures, Japan, China, etc., I think the issue of face gets very, very important. And face is about reputation, it's about image, and clearly negotiating process, you have to actually give face and indeed save face. So does anyone have any thoughts or comments on this?
No, man, I love the way you frame it, and I like it because it just listening to you now inspired a lot of reflection.
Yes.
And I feel like in my case,
Yes.
I did this like reverse culture thing where basically the first 10 years of my professional life was either working for Japanese
Mm-hmm.
or closely with them, but
Yes.
maybe they were my clients, right? And I morphed into a relationship oriented person in
Mm-hmm.
business, not really thinking too hard about it. Although I will say this, the best salesmen that I've met in America know this instinctively.
Sure.
And that's what sets them apart. But they're more the exception than, I don't want to say the rule, but than the trend, you know? So anyway, I struggled. And so this is an American, kind of Japanized,
Yes.
but I'm also dealing with Americans in America, right?
Right.
And I actually worked for an American company in sales, and fortunately, they were long-term oriented because I told them it was going to take a long time, right? If
Yeah.
you use the relationship-oriented approach, anyway, it took me 2 years to get my first purchase order.
Oh, wow.
But this was after I had met him for lunch dozens of times and knew
Mm-hmm.
his family, and and he was a Japanese purchasing guy, right? So
Right.
so my point is, short term, it's very difficult to pull off in the U.S. environment, but
Sure.
long term, personally, I found it to be extremely effective. So
N-
those were just kind of my reflections after listening to you.
No, thank you. And I think, and this relationship is not simply confined to Asia. I think even if you go to Latin America, I think the same thing comes into play. And I did a webinar on international negotiations a few months ago, and I had a participant who was from Argentina, and she was saying that one of the challenges that Argentinians had in terms of dealing with Americans was Americans would come and then they go, and then someone else would come in. So you do not have the continuity of the relationship. And that was a problem or a challenge. So thank you, Tim. Any other observations?
Well, I liked what you said about the aggressive, well, or assertive.
Yes.
Yes, that's the behavior during communicating with people from other cultures, and it's like well, exactly what I felt, and it is so well expressed here in Japan when you see people coming from Western countries, and in the beginning, before they learn how to communicate with their Japanese counterparts, that gap between the two communication styles, and it is really so obvious, sometimes striking, to yeah. And of course there is a lot of miscommunication that happens, at least in the beginning of well, such a
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think what it does is it prevents the building of trust.
yes,
And in negotiations, trust is so important.
it is so important. And also well, we're talking about negotiations, but it also I think that it is very important even in everyday transactions, business transactions, and well, also when people from different cultures work just on the same project. Yeah.
Right.
And yes, that lack of trust is always probably the most important thing, or the existence of trust, and it's important in sales as well.
Right, absolutely. And thank you, Maya. Any other observations
Yeah,
or
actually, if I
comments?
may, I'm sorry, I cut you
Sure.
off. Okay, correct me if I mispronounce your name. It's a Rajesh.
Yeah, Rajesh Kumar. Yeah.
Rajesh, okay. Hi, Rajesh. So nice to meet you, and
Yes.
thank you for the great, insightful comment. And I've just while I was listening to you, I was thinking, you just referred to task oriented
Yes.
versus
Yes.
relationship
Yes.
oriented, and I'm trying to think. Okay, so let me just briefly introduce myself. I'm
Yes.
a native Japanese, but I come to the States to go to school, and
Sure.
then I never worked in Japan. And but
Okay.
I worked for a Japanese bank in LA, and I
Yes.
believe they carry the Japanese business culture. But that
Okay.
was only about it. And then I've been working for U.S. companies much
Mm-hmm.
longer than my Japanese experience. So to me, I think I might be task oriented, but if I put as a summary, like a Japanese business style is relationship based,
Yes.
and the US is more task oriented. Is that the
Correct.
distinction, or?
Yes, yes, that's a fundamental distinction. That's right, And I can also share my own experiences. When I interviewed both American and Japanese managers, it's a long time ago, but so even the American managers were very professional and open and all of this, but the Japanese managers were much more generous with their time. And many of them invited me out for lunch, and we continued our relationship. And I maintained contact and dialogue with them many years, even after our interactions were over. So I think that is giving you an idea as to how they approach social situations. Whereas for American managers, I met them, they were professional, and then we moved along. So I think that's one of the key differences. Now, there are lots of other differences or ways in which culture affects negotiations. I can't get into all of them, but I think two aspects I will mention. One is the question of time. And different cultures have very different conceptions of time. So in India, time is very elastic. In North America, Europe, you have a meeting at 8 a.m. and you begin at 8 a.m. And so this also can cause a problem because in cultures such as India, negotiations can take time, and there isn't the recognition that time is money. Time is viewed in almost cyclical fashion rather than in a linear fashion. So I remember I was talking to a Danish manager once, and they had gone to India to negotiate a joint venture deal, and so at the first meeting, the Indian side of the delegation arrived 2 hours late for the meeting, and then the and then the Danes told them, well, if we can't even agree on a timing for meeting, then how can we go ahead with the joint venture? So, I think the aspect of time is very, very critical as well. And Tim can speak to it as well. From an American standpoint, you have a certain amount of time. You want to sign the deal, close the contract, and get on with it. Correct?
Generally speaking, yes, because
Yeah,
people are not very patient. They want next quarter's results.
exactly.
And
Exactly.
the Japanese companies I work with, it was a startup, actually two startups. They were
Yes.
looking they were looking at 10 years into the future. That was
Right.
their timeline, and then they focused on the process.
Right, exactly. So I think it's important to be sensitive to time because then you can plan your negotiating strategy around that, and
Oh, sorry.
you can take that into consideration.
Okay, you used the term elastic
Yeah.
describing Indian,
Yes.
concept. That
Yeah.
was kind of interesting term. But I'm not. Thank you, though. I'm going to blame my. I'm very impatient. Maybe you can tell by the way I talk. But I'm going to blame that on American culture. But anyway, so let me. So what is okay? So okay, it's one thing to understand there's a differences
Sure.
in management and business style.
Yes.
How do you reconcile those differences in the real setting?
Right. So I think, so I think you've got to become culturally aware, yes, as to what those differences are. And then you've got to, if you're not culturally aware, you need a facilitator, you need a consultant who can guide you through the process. And through this, ultimately, you negotiate the way that you're going to work with the other party. And it can be done, but I think it requires preparation, it requires effort, and certainly it requires understanding of the other party's mindset. So ultimately, negotiation becomes a meeting of the mind. And meeting of the mind then requires understanding the other party, understanding your own interests, and then trying to come to a basic agreement. And when you have these cultural differences, then you've got to be careful and probably work more subtly and more sensitively. Does that
Interesting.
answer your question?
Yeah, no, I love the term. You said negotiation. What did you say? That I'm going to write this down. Negotiation is a meeting of a mind, you said?
Yeah, meeting of the minds, because both of you agree. When you sign the contract, you agree that what the other party's obligations are, what your obligations are. So you have a shared vision as to what this contract or this deal is going to do, right? Because unless you don't have that meeting of the minds, there will be no negotiated contract.
Right. So, but I was just, like that was a shame that you just, cited the example that, so the U.S. and the Indian delegations and, their hours of concept are so vastly different. So
Time, yes.
time is different. Now you said,
Yeah.
so the joint venture fell apart?
No, so actually, I think, no, it did not fall apart. So I
Okay.
think they communicated to them the importance of time to them. And, then they were able to actually agree that things will proceed on time. But the Danes wanted to make clear to the Indians that this is not the way we are going to do things.
Right. So, do you have any other example involving different culture we all should be aware of? Like maybe Maya can speak. I don't know, maybe about Europeans, but what are the another pitfall that we may encounter? We should be aware of.
Well, there's so many, it's hard to cover all of this.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
But I've talked about relationships, which I think is the most important. I think time is very important as well. I think the third thing is also very important is the approaches to contract. Is contract flexible or is it rigid? So in North American, European cultures, you have contractual rigidity. Once you sign a contract, you're bound by it. Whereas in other cultures, if the situations change, they expect that you're going to be more forthcoming in terms of adjusting your expectations and all of that. So this difference, I think, is also important to consider because so if you're doing business in India or in some other countries, I think you have to be aware of this difference and plan your negotiating strategy accordingly.
Thank you.
Hello. Yeah, does
Jimmy, I
that?
hate to be, I see, I have a bunch of questions, but I don't want to keep talking, so maybe I should, yeah.
Okay, all right. Anyone else would like to comment?
Yes, sure. And also, before we continue with the questions here between the four of us, to everybody who is in the room, if you are in a situation where you can speak, please don't hesitate to join us. Raise your hand and let me
Sure.
bring you up on stage. So it was interesting, Rajesh, about what you said about, the contracts and the rigidity or flexibility of contracts. Because to me personally, it is interesting to see, especially in Japan here, how it is really difficult to actually to create, to develop trust-based relationship with Japanese counterparts. It takes time, but at the same time, once you have developed that relationship and you have a contract, so people here actually expect you to be more flexible, with the contract.
Correct. Yes.
It is in the beginning, it looked like a phenomenon to me, something that is actually counter intuitive, right? But it happens so much, and so like once you have that trust, which is actually not anything put black on white.
Right.
The thing that is put black on white can be how can I put it? Really, it's difficult to shape it in words, but the thing that is actually put on paper can be or is perceived as something that is more flexible.
Right. So as I said, in the 90s and all, I'd built up excellent relationships with some Japanese managers. I invited them to come and give a talk at the universities where I was teaching. They were willing to do so. And some of them also gave me funding for some conferences which we were organizing. Now, this was all the outcome of the relationship that I developed with them. Okay. And so I began as a doctor doing this research interviews, but then I maintained contact with them. And they were happy to maintain contact with me. And as and when I was in New York or in Seattle or San Francisco, and if our schedules permitted, we would meet for a drink or lunch. It just emphasizes the importance of relationships.
Yeah, I was just, is it okay?
Go ahead.
I saw the exact same phenomenon in Japanese and U.S. automotive when I compared the two.
Yes.
So I'm with a startup and I'm working with a Japanese company. They're from rural Japan, and they're used to working with tool suppliers and other suppliers for 40 years, and there's this relationship that goes way back, and this trust that's been built up. So their contracts were like 5 pages. Okay,
exactly.
And it had a lot of phrases in there like, if there's any disputes, we will all work it out in good faith. Those kind of like really vague statements, right? And
that's right.
Then they come to the U.S. and they're saying, can we do these contracts? And the Americans are going, no, are you nuts? American contracts were like 100 papages long, and they were at least 100, and they were tied very specifically to blueprint drawing specifications, which all had to be drawn to what we call the ANSI standards. It was countrywide. You all follow the same protocol, right? And every Japanese company had their own protocol, and their drawings were ambiguous. It just was crazy, and the Japanese didn't realize we're tying these to the contract, and if it's not clear, then we're going to get in trouble down the line. And so the Japanese because they're working in the American environment,
Yeah, they have to
had
adapt.
to adjust, but they
Sure.
had to be educated.
No, absolutely.
And that was the
And
challenge. So anyway, I saw
yeah,
that.
yeah. All right. So let me make a few other observations about negotiating cross culturally. So, what negotiating cross culturally does is it challenges your core assumption of what negotiation is. Is negotiation a problem solving activity? Is negotiation about relationships? Very critical. It also exposes you to a new language of communicating and relating. So in different cultures, the way you interact with people, the way you negotiate, the way you communicate, is very different. So in certain cultures, such as India or even Japan, people are very reluctant to say no, and sometimes even no might are reluctant to say yes. And no, I'm sorry, reluctant to say no, and sometimes even yes can actually mean a no. So I think you've got to be sensitized to it. And also, I think what it does is it challenges you to expand your comfort zone at each and every moment. Because when you're negotiating in a cross cultural context, each situation is different, and you might be so certainly you might be forced to spend time building relationships or going out drinking or participating in banquets and all of this. And so that means you've really got to be flexible enough to be able to do that. So negotiation can be very challenging, and I think you've got to really understand how culture can in fact impact the negotiation process. So the point I would like to make certainly here is be prepared to expand your comfort zone, and because without that it'll be difficult to succeed in a cross-cultural negotiating setting. Maya, what's been your experience?
Well, exactly what the same as your comment at the moment, and yes,
Yeah,
definitely need to expand. Let's say, to be flexible first of all, and
sure.
be able to accept the differences. Because if you don't, you're going to be
Exactly.
frustrated all the way through.
Exactly.
Yes, indeed. So I'm just, yeah. While I was listening to you, I was thinking about, a recent thing that. Well, it's not so recent actually, but
What happened?
yeah. Okay. So I remember that when I was well, it was not negotiating in the beginning exactly, but I had to contact actually a person in Dubai because
Yes.
one of our let's say okay, one of our managers was going to participate in an international conference there, and then
Hmm.
I needed to just talk with the person there and find out the details. And it was not exactly negotiation, but it was so really very difficult, to get to that person. First of all, to talk to me, and
Yes.
I mean. It was strange to me. I think that first of all I was a woman, and that guy
Yeah, sure.
he was not really prepared to talk to a woman, and
Right.
to have me negotiate the prices at the end of the day because we needed, to find a reasonable hotel, and everything
Yeah.
and so on. And it took so long, and it took like, oh my dear, I, yeah, maybe about
Right.
three
Well,
weeks.
your process would have been short circuited if you knew someone who could have introduced you.
Exactly, yes, but there was
Yeah.
nobody. We had no connections, no
Okay.
relation. We knew at that point with the person. So it was really so difficult to communicate with that person, and at the end of the day it took about 3 weeks to decide a simple thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it does. And that is the other thing I think which is also very important in cross-cultural negotiations is ideally you will be introduced to the party you're negotiating with by someone who knows you and someone who knows them.
Yes.
I think that's how most business deals are done. That's how things will become that much easier because when you have a third party in between, I think you begin the interaction with a certain level of trust
Yes, indeed.
because both the parties trust the third party. And so then you can move ahead. So when GM formed its first joint venture with Toyota in the early 1980s in the US, the negotiation was facilitated by a Korean executive who knew people in both companies.
Yeah, yes, indeed.
And even then, it took about 18 or 20 months to finalize the contract.
Right. I remember also another, it's a very short story, but remember it was actually about 2 years ago when, a person here in Japan who has their own business. So he approached me and said, could you please, introduce me to one of the members of your association?
Yes.
And then it was so funny because I didn't actually have anybody, I didn't know a person in that company who was working in that company at the moment, but there was a colleague of mine whom I could, ask to do the introduction.
Yeah.
And then that colleague of mine, when I asked him to do that, so basically and I was present when that colleague of mine made the phone call, to the company. So in order to create trust, and to tell that company that, they don't have to worry about, this new thing. So that person actually had to tell them first about me, who I was, how long I had worked with him.
Right.
Also, they also went into detail telling that person that, of course, I was a foreigner, but my husband was Japanese, and they could trust me and what I was saying. So because they could trust me, they could trust the person I was trying to introduce as well.
Right.
It was really fascinating to me because back home, people would never go into personal details like this, right? Mm-hmm. But, that's what happened here. And I believe that you need that additional layer.
Right. So I think the other thing also is that, in Japan and in other countries, when the introduction is being made, I think the assumption is, that it's not a short-term thing. There might be some long-term longevity inbuilt in it.
Yes, indeed. That is also a very good point. And
and so which is why they want to know a lot about you before you get to know them.
Indeed, yes.
And that's what because another thing what relationship building does is it reduces uncertainty. Because by building trust, you get to know who the other person is, how they're going to behave in different situations, so you can become more comfortable.
Indeed, that is what in Japan they call peace of mind. And it's very important here. I mean,
right, absolutely, yes.
It's important for, the end customers. It's important for your business partners. It's important for everybody. So, and I think it's one of the key concepts that people need to understand when they work with Japanese companies.
No, absolutely, yes. So let me make a few more observations.
Rajesh,
go ahead.
Just one more comment, because you mentioned something really good, important, I think, and that is how the go-between can be like a shortcut, to help the relationship building process along. But I also think it's very important for people to be aware, and anyone in this room who knows Japan knows this.
Yes.
But the person who does the introduction now has a tremendous amount of responsibility.
Correct.
That person indeed introduced a trustworthy person.
Correct.
And I've been put in situations in the past where I was asked, could you introduce me to somebody? But I didn't know that person. I didn't trust them or not trust them. I just didn't know them. And I had to avoid it. So anyway, that was just one dimension, but I agree that those introductions are invaluable.
Right. So again, it's a question of relationship as well, because when I'm introducing someone to you, I cannot introduce anyone nilly-willy, because then that is going to undercut my own credibility. So to maintain the relationship, and so that is the reason why Maya, she mentioned they were asking a lot of details, because they wanted to be sure and to be comfortable in terms of who this individual is, and then once that is met, then they can actually go ahead. All right, so let me make a few other observations. So essentially, when you're not really familiar or you're exposed to cultural surprises, then often negotiators can get very puzzled. They can feel frustration. They can feel anxiety. And so you have these emotions that can come. And I think it's important to be able to manage those emotions very, very effectively. And so, one final thing I think I will conclude with, and then if there are other questions, I'll be happy to address them. And the question that is often asked and raised as in cross cultural negotiations is, what kind of skills do individuals need to be able to negotiate effectively across cultural boundaries? I'll share some of my thoughts, and perhaps all of you can add some as well. So, at an individual level, I think we need people who are patient, who have a good tolerance for ambiguity, who are open, who have a relationship orientation, and who are flexible. I would also say that they need to have good emotional capability and the awareness and the motivation for coping in different situations. And most importantly, they should be willing to learn from failure. Maya, Tim, do you agree with all of these?
Yes, absolutely. And I also think that, I agree with you on every point you said, you mentioned, but I also think that some people, even though they don't have these abilities in the beginning, they can develop them, right? So experience is very important as well.
Of course, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, some people are more, let's say more, they have a better predisposition, to doing this kind of job. Some people are not so lucky, but at the end of the day, I think that, the experience, the depth of experience, also the breadth of the experience help.
Sure.
Yes.
Right. Absolutely. And I think, Tim, and you've had a lot of experience over the years.
I think sincerity is also sometimes underrated, because when people feel that you're sincere, and specifically with the Japanese, even if you make cross-cultural mistakes, they forgive you because they see that you're trying, that you're sincere, you're genuine. And people who are genuine and sincere, I think, tend to learn quickly and adapt.
No, absolutely. I think I can agree with that. Absolutely. So just a couple of final thoughts, and then in the context of negotiations. So, I think first, there are these cultural differences, but we should not actually stereotype people. And so every situation is going to be different, going to be unique. And in negotiating cross culturally, you have to look obviously at cultural differences, but also at the type of negotiation you are entering into. So there's often a culture by situation interaction. There are a couple of other issues that really come into play, and I think there's no clear-cut answer for them, but I think it's something that you need to be aware of. So the first thing is, we know about trust, that it is very hard to build and it is very easy to destroy. So one of the questions you have to ask yourself as a negotiator is, at what time do you know that the trust that you have is sufficient? Because that is critical. You think you trust the other party, but does the other party trust you in the same way or to the same degree? And so related to this, how do we know that it will not collapse? So there has to be some assessment of it. Second, we've talked a lot about culture, but I think it's also important to recognize that sometimes there are other barriers that come into negotiations. And so at times, culture, people say, oh, yeah, the cultural differences are too much and we couldn't sign the deal. But maybe that is being used as an excuse for not signing the deal. So it's not that you have culture as the barrier, but simply that it's a ready-made explanation for why the deal did not work out. So I think you have to be careful of that. So there are general parameters in terms of understanding cross-cultural negotiations, but I think we also need to be cognizant of the fact that each situation is very unique. And so we shouldn't necessarily transfer from the general to the specific without analyzing the situation in depth or in any particular context. So those are my thoughts on cross-cultural negotiations, and I'm happy to address and take other questions.
So you said, we should be careful not to stereotype.
Yeah, correct.
Yes, I got that. Okay, but sometimes, sort of like having preconceived notion can be helpful. For
Right.
example, like, earlier days of my banking career, I had a chance to speak with, some counterparts in Chinese companies, and then
Yes.
during the lunchtime or like a break time, she asked me how much I was making. And I was surprised. I don't think U.S. people, shy
Sure.
away from this type of question.
Yes,
And I'm like,
correct.
and I asked, my sort of like a Chinese friend who have lived in the States, and they said it's okay to ask those personal questions in China. So I said,
Right.
okay. So like when you encounter those and then I don't remember how I responded. How we should handle those questions? You sort of like come from left field, so to speak.
Yeah. So I think it has to be done delicately because,
Yeah.
you're saying no, but, you could just, you could just convert it into some kind of other normal conversation or move away from it. There's a question is asked and you can deflect it by raising another question, for instance. And so it really, you don't necessarily need to answer it. You've just got to do it in a polite way, implicitly, indirectly, saying that you just don't want to move on and maybe discuss something else. And yes, your other point about stereotyping, yes, there is a grain of truth in stereotyping, which is and so is beneficial from that standpoint, certainly. But every situation is unique. And so you've got to analyze each negotiating situation. And it's not just the culture, then it's also the personality of the various negotiators. And that also might come into play. And third of all, what is the stake in the negotiating situation? Is it a high stake situation? Is it a low stake situation? Because that also becomes very, very important.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yes, and I love what you said about personality, because yes, of course, it feeds back to what you said, that sometimes, depending, the cultural differences can be an excuse, but at the end of the day, after you analyze the situation, you can realize that it's somebody's personality
right.
actually didn't allow you to finalize the negotiation.
Yeah, so I think there's so many variables that come into play in a negotiation.
Yes, there are.
And culture is only one of them.
Indeed. And also remember that how important it is when, in organizational structures as well, personality.
Sure.
Yes, such a big.
Absolutely.
And it is quite underestimated because we tend to think that, well, yes, a company is a company and everybody in the company is more or less the same and they move in more or less the same way that has been shaped by the culture of that company, but it's actually not true.
No, not true. Not at all. Not at all. Yeah, absolutely.
And Tim, sorry, I think that interrupted.
Tim was saying something.
Yes.
No, I suspect, I have nothing to back this up, but I suspect that in many cross-cultural negotiations that don't work out,
yes,
both sides don't understand each other enough to know whether it's going to work or not. But
right.
But in many cases, they think they know enough about each other to make the determination, and oftentimes they assign nefarious intentions when they weren't intended, but you don't know that, the perception.
Correct. Absolutely. And as I mentioned earlier, we see the world as we are. And so we are all under the control of our mind, and the mind wants predictability. And the predictability comes from making inferences even when you do not have all the information. So I think that becomes very critical and indeed very, very an important issue to consider. Absolutely. And so, just a question for you and Maya. And do you think the Japanese, they've now been operating in the global arena for a long time? Do you think that are they becoming more sophisticated as global negotiators?
Well, that's a great question. And I think that if you don't mind me just, going a little bit in a little bit different direction.
Sure.
I would say that the Japanese, those guys who who work overseas or who work with international companies, so they are really very good negotiators. And I'll tell you why. That's part because of the Japanese mindset. And that, my view on this is that the Japanese are much more capable actually of sensing what the other person or other sides, the other side's intentions and expectations are.
Yeah.
So this is part of the Japanese national character, part of Japanese genes, if you wish.
Sure.
So yes, and I would say that yes, sometimes they may be seen as unsophisticated and so on, but at the end of the day, so that is the Japanese way of negotiating.
Sure.
And I would say that the Japanese are much better negotiators than we give them credit to be.
Right. Okay.
But maybe,
Right.
this is just my opinion, and I usually tend to be much more positive, about things that I see around me. And some people in the room may have a different opinion, or, probably
Sure, of course.
of mine.
Tim, what do you think?
Well, I want to echo what Maya said. Like, I've really come to realize what I've been in my own little manufacturing bubble. So what I say within the context of where I worked isn't necessarily true for the people in the audience, right? And I spent most of my career in the cross-cultural field in the U.S. working with Japanese people, right? So some of them, I agree with Maya, they were brilliant. And I used to be the interpreter when we started negotiating with potential suppliers and other vendors, right?
Sure.
And it was funny. This is kind of a funny story, but so we sat through this really fancy schmancy American presentation. It was for a phone system, and then at the end, the guy gives the price, right?
Yeah.
And the Japanese love to just not say anything. That's just kind of like the default mode, right?
Yeah.
So everybody shuts up in the room, and now the American salesman is panicking.
Yeah.
Because he can't read what they're thinking, and they're not
Right.
complaining. So it wasn't, but he starts panicking, and he starts lowering his price.
Yeah, exactly.
He's negotiating against himself because it's silence that's making him uncomfortable, right?
Right.
And I still remember it was this epiphany for my Japanese comrades at the company because they start looking at each other, and then they started using that as a strategic technique in all further negotiations.
Wow. Very clever.
So they were, but I wouldn't say they were all good, but the ones who adapted, like Maya said, really were good because they were so thorough. And I think, kind of one point I think that you made today, and I'd like to quote Edward T. Hall, and he said, I'm paraphrasing. He said, cross-cultural communication isn't is so much about sending the right message. It's about getting a desired response. And I would extrapolate and say, I think not just cross-cultural, I think all communication is that way. And what that implies is that communication is strategic. And by understanding the other culture and the other culture understanding you, you can employ this knowledge to strategically communicate in a way where you get a desired response. And
Absolutely.
and the one example, and Maya and Yuka and I were talking offline one time, but if let's play make believe. If I were in a room with a bunch of friends and it was really hot in that room, if all those friends were American friends, I would yell across the room to my friend Bob near the window. I'd say, "Hey Bob, it's like a sauna in here. Open the damn window." And he would laugh and he would open the window, and that would be my desired response, right?
Right.
But if everybody in that room was Japanese, I would
Mm-hmm.
turn to the person next to me and quietly say in Japanese, am I the only one that's hot? Are you hot? Is it a little
Yeah.
bit hot in here? And I would be
Got it.
giving this indirect hint, and before you know it, somebody would go open the window,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Now,
yeah.
I'm employing two different strategies based on different situations because
Sure,
Americans versus Japanese. And I think, I
sure.
don't know, is that a good example
And
to
that's a good
illustrate what I'm
example.
saying?
I mean, what you're doing is using indirect communication in the Japanese context. You're trying to draw out a group level response without necessarily putting other people on the spot. Whereas when you yell at someone and open the window, whatever, it's, you've made your preferences very clear and in an open way. So it's a very
So
different.
Radish, sorry.
Go ahead.
So Meyer and the team have been very complimentary toward Japanese management style, but
Sure.
I gather the no negotiators are perfect.
No.
So if you can suggest a pointer towards Japanese negotiators, what one thing that they can improve on, in your opinion?
So I think what I would say is that I think it's a tough one because I think I would say the communication aspect of it. That's what I would say, because communication is, and as Tim was just saying, I think communication can cause a lot of miscommunication and misunderstandings. So I think if they can be a little more clear, certainly to an audience that is, or to a constituency that maybe does not fully comprehend their culture, then I think it will facilitate the process, or at least you will avoid misunderstandings before you move further. That's what I would say.
Okay, you said clear. Communication should be more clear, meaning more direct.
Yeah, I
No,
mean, I
sorry.
think, yeah, because a lot of times I think people get into difficulties with indirect communication from the American and North American side. So I think that is very important, but it's a two-way street. So I think even from the Americans and the European standpoint, they really need to understand where the other party is coming from. So, but certainly, the Japanese can be, and they can be at times, I would say, a little more transparent, which I think might be a little challenging at times. So both transparency and communication.
Thank you. I'm sorry, and then I'd like to throw in one more question if I can.
Sure.
The earlier you talked about there are different concept or attitude, or even the way that I approach toward the contract. And
Yes.
I thought that's a very good point. The way that I understand, like a U.S. contracts are airtight. They
They're
try to,
airtight. Yes.
include every possible way that things
Correct.
can go wrong. But
Correct.
in Japan, they just sort of broadly, intentionally, and then
Sure.
they're gonna work out if something does go wrong. So
Right.
in this situation, where the end product should be, everybody has to meet in between, like everybody has to compromise, or one should
Well, so I
concede
would
to the
say,
other.
okay, so I think it really depends. I think again on the context of the contract. And so I think in global relationships, in global business, I think there is a certain standardization in terms of contracts. All contracts also have a dispute resolution settlement embedded in them. So I'm not sure, how much can be accommodated there. So what I would say is that if they actually want certain things to, so the question is not going to be the contract per se. I think it's going to be the ability of the Japanese partner to convince their American or European counterpart that because of certain circumstances change, whether they can make some modifications.
Okay, great. Thank you.
It will not be written into the contract, but I think that is going to be more of a verbal agreement, and then they can redraft it if they wish to.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you, Rajesh, and Yuka and Tim. So it's 9 o'clock. This is the time when we finish our rooms because
Sure.
it's a weekday here, the morning
Okay.
weekday in
All
Japan.
right.
And Rajesh, thank you so very much for this great topic.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you, Tim and Maya, for inviting me. Lovely to be with you.
Oh, it was my pleasure thoroughly, and I certainly believe that we're going to continue the topic in the future rooms.
Sure.
Thank you for this. Please get prepared, you and everybody else, of course.
Time to get on with the day.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So again, to everybody who is in the audience and stuck with us, thank you so very much for being here on Wednesday morning. It has been a pleasure to have you with us. And if you are interested in this topic, please stay with us in in the future as well. Or if you want to listen to discussions on different topics, also you can reach out to me or team and let us know so that we can arrange future rooms as well. With this, I wish you a great day and a very good reminder of the week. So, Rajesh, thank you so very much again.
Oh, you're very welcome, Maya and Tim. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in today. We will be on air next week on Wednesday at 8 a.m. Japan time again, so join us. Until then, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel. If you want to stay informed about our upcoming events, follow us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, or Twitter. Again, we are looking forward to your joining us next week. Until then, stay well and make the best of the day. See you!